Hello and welcome to our fifth Q&A session of our Wonder Kids Ask a Developmental Psychologist series. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Portia Creevy and I'm the recruitment coordinator for the Early Development Research Group at UBC. Joining us today is Dr. Andrew Barron, who, along with his wonderful team of trainees at the Social Cognitive Development Lab and the Living Lab at Science World, studies how children establish preferences for and beliefs about people and the strategies that can help foster a greater tolerance in their reason about social groups. Dr. Barron's Social Cognitive Development Lab is one of 7 research centers that make up the Early Development Research Group. Because much of the research that Dr. Barron will tell us about today took place on campus of the University of British Columbia, I would like to acknowledge that our campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and ceded territory of the Musqueam people. But of course, this is a virtual event, and so I would like to acknowledge as well the traditional owners and caretakers of the many lands that you may be joining from, both near and far. I'll introduce Dr. Barron in just a moment and then open the floor to questions, taking us to about 9 o'clock. To gather your questions, we will be using the Q&A window that you may access via the button along the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll be going through the questions on a first-come, first-served basis, beginning with the questions that got submitted ahead of time through our RSVP form. Please do feel free to pop in and out as you need. We understand that most of you have little ones at home. If you are unable to stay for the entire session or have technical issues, do not worry. We will be posting a recording of this session on the EDRG website. As mentioned, Dr. Barron specializes in cognitive development, but does have knowledge in other areas of child development. If you have questions in areas outside of cognitive development, Dr. Barron will be happy to share his thoughts on them, but you're welcome to attend future sessions or watch recordings of past talks that cover these topics. I am thrilled today to introduce Dr. Andrew Barron to you today. He's an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at UBC. Dr. Barron gained his PhD in psychology in 2010 from Harvard University in the United States, and in that same year began teaching here at UBC. His research on how children reason about social life, exploring a range of topics from the understanding of social status to attitudes and stereotypes about gender and race, has been a recipient of several grants and awards. Dr. Barron's accomplishments have been recognized with the UBC Killam Research Prize and the Association for Psychological Science Rising Star Award. Dr. Barron is also a student favorite here at the University of British Columbia, evident in his receipt of the Robert E. Knox Master Teaching Award. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Barron. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Barron. I'm going to go into the questions, and the first question that we have is, how early should parents be teaching their children about prejudice, stereotypes, and tolerance of other social groups?
Well, thank you for having me. It's obviously a super important question and no doubt very timely. I think the way I think of it is it's not all or nothing, that you do all the teaching and you think about what's the right age where they could handle all the concepts that one might want to teach a child about tolerance and social groups and identity and understanding. I think it's something that you can really break down and have conversations in age-appropriate ways, directly and indirectly, with your child. As a parent, it's something that I began probably when my child was about 3 or 4, I would say. Started having conversations more directly, and of course, the complexity of those conversations increase with age. He's now 11. And so we're able to have more reflective conversations about concepts like structural inequality, but certainly introducing children to the idea of treating people fairly, and the idea of discrimination, and certainly around age 3 to 4. And one reason why that it can be a good age for young children to start having more explicit conversations with them is their linguistic capacity. Obviously there's a lot of variation in language development, but they've got a little bit of a grasp of a vocabulary that can allow them to talk. Also around that age, there's a lot of research, my own and others in the field, that show that children, even if parents aren't talking with them about social groups, are mentally thinking about people in terms of social group identity. So they're thinking about gender, they're thinking about race, certainly in Western societies where there's a fair amount of research on this. And so if kids are already mentalizing, people based on these kinds of social dimensions, then it's certainly an opportune time to start having conversations about how we don't want to treat people differently based on that, and to talk about the different forms of bias and discrimination that people may feel, much the same way that parents often will spend a lot of time focusing on teaching fairness, turn taking, sharing to children at this age. I think it's just as important to have conversations around stereotyping and bias with kids around this age. And again, I think it's the complexity of the conversations ought to increase as the child gets older. I would say that what a parent can do that's mindful about social bias before even ages 3 and 4 is thinking about the kinds of storybooks that you pick out to your children and the kinds of exemplars that are represented in those storybooks. So even some of this work more indirectly can be done by virtue of exposing children to, heroes from other groups, or, think about counter stereotypical exemplars. So, female scientists, for example, and have children's stories around that theme, I think is really good for giving children exposure to content that runs kind of counter to the cultural stereotypes that they might be exposed to a little bit later in life.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And the next question kind of just bounces off of that. And you talked about, storybooks and introducing your children to certain mediums. And the next question is, how powerful is media, like what kids get to watch on TV, things like that? How powerful is its influence on the kind of ideas children develop about social groups? And are there different types of mediums that are more influential than, what children watch?
Yeah, well, I think the influence of media in part will be, constrained by whether the child has a lot of exposure, right? So my son, at least at, early years, first few years of life, didn't really see much on television, but so his form of media exposure was through books. And there's a lot of variation therein in what kids could be exposed to. But I do think media, certainly, there's no doubt it shapes what we think and how, and it shapes the kinds of stereotypes we have. Depictions of colonialism in cartoons, and the kind of caricatures of different cultures and how they're represented in cartoons. While maybe not explicit, is certainly contributing to children's own construction of ideas about what cultures represent, or what cultures are considered center cultures and what are considered sort of supporting cultures. And I think that there's a lot to children's programming that can reinforce cultural stereotypes. And I think one of the challenges with children's programming, and my advice to parents, is watch what kids are going to watch. So screen it and use your own good judgment about what you think is going to be appropriate. But oftentimes, even programs that maybe try to foster inclusion by having, a hero that's a counter stereotypical exemplar, there may be a lot of other characters in that story that are acting in ways that are highly stereotypical. And one thing we know about memory is that we tend to have better memory for things that are congruent with existing stereotypes compared with things that are counter, those stereotypes. And so a program might on the surface appear good because there's some counter stereotypical hero, but if there's a lot of other stereotypes that might get reinforced in that show, it may not be the best. It may not be in the best interest of your child in terms of developing more inclusive attitudes and stereotypes. Media, I think of media broadly, not just what we watch, but also the toys we get for our kids and how those are positioned and advertised. And a story I often use when I teach my students about the cultural transmission of gender stereotypes is a number of years ago when we one evening, it was date night, and so we had a babysitter watching our son at the time, was maybe 3, and for lack of more interesting things to do on a date night, we went to HomeSense. And I remember being totally bored out of my mind. This wasn't my choice to go. I remember just walking around the toy section, and there was a big sign that said girls' toys on one sort of section of an aisle, and everything there had to do with homemaking and kitchen stuff and dolls and stuff like that. And it was clear that it was sending a message about these are the kinds of things that girls ought to play with. Now, it was really fascinating that there's no restriction or designation of what constitutes boys' toys. So it's almost like there's more freedom for boys to kind of pick and choose what they want to do, but clearly roles were being defined for girls. And I think that especially when I look at my own academic research, and then we show that children are already having ideas about gender role expectations 7 years of age. They're getting information just from, I'd say, cultural sources, like how toys are advertised. And so I think of media very broadly, not just the books and the shows, but other mediums by which society is communicating something about their beliefs about gender in particular, but you also see this in race and other social categories in North America anyway.
That's very interesting, that pretty much anything that the child is interacting with can become a form of media that they are learning from. That's really interesting. We do have another question, and it's what if my child, 2 years old and 9 months, has had social anxiety problems since she was about 6 to 7 months of age. She shakes and gets really scared if we go to places with other people. She's really scared if she knows that we are going to a place with familiar people, example, friends or relatives place, whether it's indoor or outdoor.
Yep. So I'm going to do what's called phoning a friend to help answer this question. So this is a little bit more, I think, child clinical psychology, given its emphasis on anxiety, which isn't my expertise. However, it is my wife's expertise. So my wife is a registered child clinical psychologist here in Vancouver. We actually met when we were getting our PhDs at Harvard. And she reminds me all the time that she's smarter than me. And her specialization is child anxiety, depression, suicidal behavior, suicidal ideation, and is just sort of the leading expert in this in Vancouver, particularly for children and adolescents. So I'm going to defer to her. So okay. And her name is Bethany Michelle.
Hi.
Thank you so much, Bethany, for joining us.
Sure. So the question is, a child, do we have the question in writing somewhere? Okay. Okay, so social anxiety problems, again, one of the things that we want to think about with this is temperament. So kids are born with a temperament, right? Temperament is largely genetically encoded. I'm going to pull up the piano bench here.
Sure.
Temperament is largely genetically encoded. And so as kids come into the world, they have this just sort of like innate temperament, either how they react to stimuli, either something new is a little bit overwhelming, or something new is like, oh, they're kind of cool, like, oh, what could this be? And so there's a whole range of that. So it's not surprising to me that some kids, even toddlers, right, are going to show behaviors that are maybe a little more anxiety based.
Okay.
Depending on where a kid is on this spectrum, you're going to see different sort of sensitivities, different levels of reactions to the same kind of events or environments. And so if you have a kid who tends to be, as it sounds, this kid is fairly socially anxious, social anxiety
Hello.
And so it's often the idea of being separated from the protection or care of the main caregiver.
Yeah.
And if what's going on is that, like, specifically, like if we have, let's say I take my kid to, my mom's house and we're hanging out, and suddenly, because I'm with my mom and I'm enjoying spending time with my mom, my attention is more on that. Whereas if we're around more strangers, my attention is likely to be more on my kid, right?
Okay.
So we want to be thinking about, like, how is my behavior different? And what is that maybe signaling to the kid?
Okay.
And so if the kid is feeling like this is like a situation where my parents feel safe and relaxed, it's relatives, it's friends, it's whatever, the parents probably are attending a little bit less to the kid. And if a kid has this really sort of heightened anxiety and this like separation stuff, that might trigger those kind of fears more easily than, a kid who is with that same parent, but the parent isn't attending to those relationships.
Okay.
And so anytime we're working with child anxiety, we're really working on like taking tiny little baby steps, right? So we want to help them get more comfortable in situations, but we don't want to like, throw the kid in the water and be like, good luck, sink or swim, right? That doesn't tend to work. It makes kids, especially anxious kids, fare worse. And so we want to like talk to them and say, what is it? Do you have any ideas? Or ask them what they think might be going on, what you're noticing. And if they're not clear about the fact that they're feeling like scared, but they're like, I just feel like my tummy hurts or my head hurts or something like that, you can say, I noticed that this seems to happen a lot in this kind of situation. Your tummy hurts. What do you think's going on there? And just sort of like try and get some information from them. And that's my answer if it's like all familiar people and all relatives, depending on how the parent's interacting. If it's specific people, they may not have had like good interactions, or they may feel like that person doesn't really get them or doesn't come down to their level. Some people just aren't kid people, right? And so it could be like those are some specific relationships that make them uncomfortable because they feel like they're not really understood, or something like that. So I would say that there's a couple pieces. There's a bit of nature, and the nurture piece that you can do is try to help them navigate what they need to feel safe in those environments. And so beforehand, like when you're not in the situation, don't wait till you get there if you can. When you're not in the situation, you want to say like, hey, water bottle child, what do you think might help you feel more comfortable? What might help settle your tummy? They're probably going to say like, if you're around me the whole time. Okay, well, I might not be able to, but what can we do that's sort of like that? Right. And so maybe this first time we can be around each other the whole time, and we'll see how that goes. And then we can try and take little steps so that you feel more free and so that I can hang out with my friend.
Yeah.
So again, tiny little baby steps, checking in with the kid, checking in before you go and checking in after, like, was there anything that happened that made you feel uncomfortable? And just be really open to like whatever it is they say, so that you're not like, and they might even say like, I don't like that person. So you don't want to come down like, you have to like that person, blah, 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 right? Or even if that's your grandma, you have to like her. If you want to keep the lines of communication open with your kid, you want to be as neutral as possible. Even if you're like, ouch, you can be like, oh, like, what's up? What is it about that you don't like? Or what is it about her you don't like? Or what is it about being around her you don't like? So that they can get into some more like behavioral descriptions of what makes them uncomfortable. And you can help them sort of figure out and coach them, like, how can you deal with being in situations around people you don't like? Because that's going to happen sometimes.
Yeah.
So how can you help yourself be more brave and still feel safe?
Yeah.
That's my answer.
Thank you so much, Bethany. So it's really about, following the lead of the child and like letting them tell you what's going on with them.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
I'll be back if it's needed.
And the next question is also specific to a child, or to the parent's experience, and it's, how do I get my almost 3-year-old baby to ditch the milk bottle. He is so attached to it and seems to depend on it before bed and as soon as he wakes up in the morning, and will often wake up asking for it in the middle of the night as well.
Yeah. So it's an interesting question. I guess I'd want to know why is that important? So what is the concern about the child continuing to ask for the bottle at that age? And I could imagine a couple, things. Maybe there's just sort of a sense in which, is the child too old for it? You could also imagine maybe you're hearing from a dentist that it might not be good having milk on direct contact, with the teeth, and the risk for cavities and things like that. And my feeling is, if the concern that's motivating this question is coming from, say, like a health perspective of, could there be a risk for cavities? And one thing you could do is certainly, if the bottle itself is, and the experience of the bottle is providing some measure of comfort to the child, one could perhaps just dilute the milk, with water, which is going to have it reduce then the risk for cavities. Substitute the milk with water. So there's still the comfort component that's perhaps what drives the child's interest in it. But reduces the parent's concern about, say, that direct contact of the milk on the teeth, and in the fashion that's delivered via the bottle that could risk, cavities at that age. If there's if the primary motive concern of the parent is that, is my child just too old for it? What I would say is that children, there's no one age. That's the age when it ought to stop. Children might have a need for the comfort that the bottle is providing, and if you just pull that away, and it serves an attachment function or a soothing function to the child, I think that could be particularly hard, especially if cognitively they can't appraise that situation, find something else to provide that kind of comfort and support. So if the concern is just about, well, I don't see other kids doing it, I would say, but your kid's telling you it's indirectly, right, that it's kind of important to them and meaningful to them, and so I'd roll with it. And I think if the concern is about the health side of it, I think there's things you could do to dilute or replace the milk, so it reduces, say, risk of cavities or things like that at that age.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Next question, this is more of a general question, and is, what are some of the effects of prejudice or discrimination on children's development? And as a parent of a child from a minority group, how can you support them when they're being bullied or affected by other people's discrimination?
Sure. Well, there's a lot there to pack. So in terms of effects of prejudice and discrimination, I think that there's certainly work showing that it can influence children's academic performance, especially if the prejudice or discrimination that they perceive or experiencing has to do with identities that have academic stereotypes associated with them. And so you often see this in the case with gender and race. And sometimes they're even they're specific to certain content areas like math, and there's gender stereotypes about math, and there's more global stereotypes about race and academics. And so I think the experience of discrimination, even if it's not someone saying, you aren't good at math, but is making gender salient, for example, and being made to feel othered because of that identity, often what we see is that children will then start to underperform in those classes. They feel what's called stereotype threat, where there's this sort of chronic, sort of longstanding awareness and heightened sensitivity to the fact that people have an expectation of some identity of yours underperforming. And so then children, even as young as 7, 8 years of age, will start to struggle more in school when they are experiencing or are reminded of an identity that's discriminated against. In our own research, we even see that when children hold, so this is really fascinating and sad at the same time, but this is research that we did at Science World. 3 and 4-year-old children To the extent that 3 and 4-year-old girls have the stereotype that math is a little bit more for boys than it is for girls. So some girls have that stereotype, other girls don't. The girls that have that stereotype, when you give them a math exercise and you remind them of their gender before taking that math exercise, they will perform worse than when and tell them that that's a math exercise. Hey, we're going to do a math exercise, and something to the effect of reminding them of their gender. They'll perform worse on that math exercise at 3 to 4 years of age.
That's
So it's before they enter primary school. Now, you don't see the effect for girls who don't have the stereotype. So it shows that just the fact, whether or not just having a stereotype and then being reminded of something about yourself that kind of relates to that stereotype, you then perform in a stereotype congruent way, meaning you underperform in that domain, in that area of the math test. We see these effects with adults. In fact, that's what originally motivated this research, was to find out how early in development it begins. And then what we're trying to do is figure out how to intervene and sort of, disrupt that, because we think that children are going to certainly be exposed to the stereotypes that other people have, but we don't want that influencing and affecting how they feel about themselves, how they perform in the classroom, for example. So that's one area where it can influence their development in terms of thinking about academic growth. They can also influence the goals that children have. So the perception that they might be discriminated against in certain areas may lead children to avoid, say, for example, pursuing math courses in secondary school or post-secondary school, avoiding math and science classes if they feel that it's not going to be an inclusive experience, right? In particular, I think we see this with young girls. If they don't think that they're going to be supported, if they think that people are going to hold stereotypes against them or be biased against them because of their gender, they can you can see this resulting in a shift in what those goals are that the child has for their education, for their professional development. In terms of how one might, say, support children when they're being bullied or affected by others' discrimination.
Oh, you froze for a minute.
Be doing, whether or not, quite frankly, their child is being bullied, and that is helping children to learn. Oh, sorry,
you froze for a minute, so we lost a bit of what she was saying.
Okay, at what point did I freeze?
When you're talking about the stereotypes that people hold, about a couple of seconds ago.
Yeah. So so the idea is that what we see in secondary school and post-secondary school for young girls is that just being aware that other people have stereotypes, even culturally, about their group can lead them to pursue career goals that are where they feel that there's greater a sense of inclusion, so they'll be less likely to be drawn towards things like math and science if they feel that the people in that space have biases against their social group.
Okay.
On the idea of bullying and what we can do when how can you support a child that's being bullied or affected by others' discrimination? I'd say here that there's something all parents can do, regardless of whether your child is being bullied. And so maybe first I'll focus on just parents in general with their children. And that is teaching children how to recognize bullying and stand up to it, and becoming an ally to children who are being bullied, because it's really hard for a child if they're being bullied and there isn't someone that can provide some support and reduce that sense of isolation. And so I think that there's a responsibility for all parents to try to help their children not just be able to label, hey, that person's being a bully, but actually to stand up for the person that's being bullied, and to be reaching out to someone that, is being excluded. In terms of a child that's being bullied and how you can support that child, a lot will depend on the age right? And the kinds of conversations. A conversation with my son when he was 3 and 4 about this looks really different than now when he's 11, or maybe and probably still different from when he was about 8. In that when they're older, you can certainly have more conversations that rely on kind of introspection and self-reflection. At 3 to 4, there's I think it's important to try to figure out certainly what the basis is. You want to focus on labeling the behavior that the person is engaged in as wrong and bad, as opposed to saying there's just there are bad people out there. When you use language that that there's just bad people out there as opposed to bad behavior, it can reinforce other kinds of stereotypes in kids and lead kids to think that these kinds of behaviors are fixed and can't be changed. And you want them to think that sort of these behaviors are things that can be changed. I think it's important with parents, when a child is being bullied, if they're 3, 4, 5 years of age, think about whether those are environments the child has to be in, right? I think we, as parents, those kinds of experiences can be really hard for a young child to process and make sense of. Why would they be teased or made fun of in this way? I think it's important to, certainly be having conversations about stereotypes and why they're wrong and why they're harmful, so the child understands that. I think it's important perhaps to try to communicate that that perhaps the person who's doing the bullying is confused, doesn't understand, is angry about something else. So there's something about that person's motivation, that it's not that these are true things that they're saying, but something else is happening that's leading to this kind of behavior. So the child doesn't start to believe the substance of what that person is doing that feels bullying. But certainly if there's something that's chronic, like if this is happening at school, the school is responsible for ensuring that a child isn't treated in this way. So it's really important that you also help to give a voice to the child that's being bullied, where they feel that they can communicate to adults. I know when my own son was experiencing some bullying, what we really tried to reinforce with him was speaking to a teacher, speaking to someone in, a principal, to make sure the school's aware, because they're I believe they're mandated to not allow that to happen. So they have to take action. If it's in something else like a club or an activity, maybe a sports team that a child participates in, and it's not something that seems to get fixed pretty quickly. If the child's young, I would certainly look to switch them out, because I don't think it's not going to be healthy to be exposed to it in a chronic fashion. But yeah, those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you so much for that. The next question kind of builds really nicely off of this one, because you spoke about how when girls have the stereotypes, then being reminded of the agenda has an influence on their performance. So are there early signs to let parents know whether their child has built some sort of stereotypes about themselves or other people that can be detrimental to themselves and others?
So I'd say a few things. One, no matter what we do as parents, children will develop biases and stereotypes, without a doubt. There's absolutely nothing parents can do to prevent some form of stereotype or bias developing. It's happened within the first year of life. Children are already forming biases, and the way it usually begins is just things that are familiar. Children tend to think are good and safe. Things that are unfamiliar, they're a little bit more wary of. And so that way of organizing the world quickly starts to extend into or encapsulate social groups. So I think there's a lot also in our language that sort of fosters thinking about people in terms of social group identity. There's a lot in society and how it's structured that makes social group identity really relevant. And so the brain is designed to pick up on what's relevant in your culture, and social categories are a part of our world. And so kids are going to notice it and they're going to think about it. And so I think what the parents then, role here is just try to both shape the content of how they think about the social groups, right? So my point is that kids will notice social categories. They'll notice gender no matter what you do. And they'll notice race, at least in North America, they're going to notice race. I'd say no matter what you do, and it just might be delayed a little bit just because of when they start to think about it. But at some point in childhood, they're going to notice it. And I think that what we can do is shape how they think about these groups. We can shape their motivation not to rely on social categories to make judgments about other people.
Okay.
And so even when so the advice I give to parents is similar to the advice I give to adults who are curious about how not to act in a biased way. And that's really fostering a motivation to not be biased and to recognize when you might be behaving in a way that's acting on a stereotype or acting on some sort of intergroup attitude that's not positive. Recognizing situations where you might act in a more biased way, recognizing when someone else is acting in a way that's perhaps discriminatory, and empowering children to both speak out against it. And so I think there's really a multi-pronged approach here. You can shape the content like we talked about at the beginning of this Q&A, but I think you can also shape the motivation to not be biased and act in biased ways. I think it's important to not shield children from evidence of discrimination in society. I think it's important that they see what happens, but you need to have conversations that are age appropriate with children about what's going on. And so during COVID, for example, there's obviously a lot of discrimination that was happening, those were opportunities for conversations that we had with our son about what's wrong with stereotyping in this way, and talking about COVID in certain ways, and blaming people in the ways that you were seeing on the news. And so I think it's important that they see that this is real, discrimination is real, and they understand what's wrong with it through having conversations about it.
Thank you so much for that. And we're actually on our last question, and I think it's a nice wrap-up question. And it's based off of the fact that children do spend a lot of their times in schools, like a lot of their years and being in school. And so are there ways that our education programs can be altered to cultivate, better tolerance in children? And if there's already some that's currently happening, in North America?
Well, I'll give you maybe a somewhat cheeky answer to this. Yes, there's things that could be done, and schools aren't doing them. And I don't see that changing the way the school systems are structured here. I think in an ideal world, if I could shape the curriculum of a school, I would ensure that these conversations around discrimination and bias, tolerance and inclusion aren't relegated to a week, of time, but they're integrated and woven in and out of various lessons, particularly as you get into, the higher grades, end of primary school and into secondary school, when you're learning a little bit more about history and social studies, being able to talk more critically about examples of discrimination. So it's constantly woven in. I also think it's really important that children can in a very structured way help children understand what the experience of discrimination is like. I think this is a case of
You
feel like I think
froze
is
for a
really
minute.
eye-opening. Oh, did I freeze?
Yeah, I think
Oh,
you're
sorry.
talking about how we can shape the experience of how children's.
Experience discrimination. I think that can be very eye-opening for children. So there's this exercise done back in the 60s in Iowa. There's this PBS special on called A Class Divided, where the teacher took the children, divided them up by eye color, and treated them differently for a day. And one of the things that was really remarkable in this exercise, you can go to pbs.org and watch this, called A Class Divided, for free. I use it in my classes every year to illustrate some key concepts. And what you see among these third graders is that the experience of discrimination for a day transformed them for life in how they made them more aware than anything else, I think, about the power of discrimination and the responsibility they have not to discriminate against others. And I think you can do these kinds of exercises in a way where the child is still safe. But I think it's okay to feel vulnerable if you're doing it in a proper way. I think the reality is, for so many children, quite frankly, who aren't in the majority, they're already feeling vulnerable in and out of school. And I think one way that you can foster allyship, one way you can increase motivation to not be biased, is for certainly all children, but certainly majority children, to experience, again, in a careful manner, what discrimination can feel like, and their propensity, and how easy it is for kids to act discriminatorily towards other people. I think that's another component to this, is that we tend to think it's a few bad apples, but that's wrong. It's all of us can be this way if we're not really motivated and trying not to be biased towards others. And I think that's important to teach children. I think often the way they're exposed to these things is it's someone else is a bully, someone else, does these hurtful things, but it's in all of us. It's in all of children to potentially act on these types of biases. And we need to show them that they could be the perpetrator, and they need to understand how wrong that is and how that feels to be perpetrated against in that fashion.
Thank you so much, Andy, for answering all these questions and sharing your insights and thoughts on these things. We're at the end of the show, so I want to thank everybody else for also joining us today and for the very interesting questions that came up. I really enjoyed learning more about, children's implicit biases and how we can foster that. I think there are things that I can even take for myself. For example, remember that I have the capacity to be that kind of person that I don't want to be treated as. And so it's very, very impactful for me as well. So I'd also like to use this moment to thank all the families that have participated in our research being done at the EDRG, including those being done in Dr. Barron's team. And so our research is only possible because of families like yours. And we always love it when you can bring somebody else to join us and join in on the fun as well, because we have so much fun and interactive activities for parents and their little ones. So always tell a friend if you feel like it's something that they would also really enjoy. If you're interested in participating with us, you can use a QR code here or the link that is included in the slide to receive more information about studies that you and your little ones may be eligible for. Great, thank you all so much once again. We hope to see you at the next Q&A session with Dr. Amberson, and I hope you have a great night. Thank you so much, Dr. Barron.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.